Hey guys, welcome to our next set of chapters from Chickadee. And before we get started, I wanted to go through a few vocabulary words with you. Kind of wish I had done this before, but I didn't want to stress anyone out too much about remembering new vocabulary. So we just have about 4 or 5 words I'd like to go through before we read it that you might be unfamiliar with, or maybe they have additional meanings you hadn't thought about. So let's go through, starting in chapter 14. The word entreated. Entreated. The context here, let me see. The context here is, as the family took leave of Margaret, she entreated them to think over all she had said. So we know that this is a verb. It ends in ed, and it's something that Margaret is doing. So let's take a look at it. Maybe some of you have a guess at what it means already, or you've heard it before. The word entreat is a verb that means to ask somebody earnestly or anxiously to do something. A good synonym would be beg or plead. Ask earnestly. That's the first one. Entreat. Okay, here's another one. You guys all know what this word means. Stir. I will not stir, said Two Strike. Now, is Two Strike saying she's refusing to move a spoon around in a pot of soup? No, she's saying she's going to stay still. In this sense, the word stir means to move around. And she's saying, I am not going to move. I am not going to go anywhere. I am staying here. I will not stir. Okay, and here's another word you know, but I just wanted to point it out that you can use it like this too. Kind of cool. At first, there was just a dot on the horizon. Somebody's watching something in the horizon. It was a curious dot. After it appeared, it disappeared. So the word curious here is the one I want to think about. We know what curious means. Curious George, he wants to know stuff. He wants to learn stuff. But here she's using it. The author is using it to describe how the dot appears. Now, is the dot itself curious? Does the dot want to know something? No, that's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is the dot makes us curious. This dot, we see it, makes us think, oh, this is unusual. In one of my favorite books, Alice in Wonderland, Alice says something is curiouser and curiouser. And it's Alice is curious. It's something that makes me curious, makes me want to know. A curious dot. Watch that. Sometimes something can be curious and sometimes it can make others curious. Okay, here's another word that might be new to some of you. So we're talking about, here they are out in the wilderness. It was a pretty spot on a small hill that sloped down to the roiling river. The roiling river. What does it mean to roil? Well, it doesn't mean like a royal king, right? It doesn't mean school royalty. That's R-O-Y-A-L. And this is royal, R-O-I-L. So let's check it out. You guys have any ideas about what royal might mean? Here we go. To roil, it means to make a liquid turbid or muddy by disturbing the sediment. Well, that's not very helpful. Roiling means like bubbling or flowing or very active, like currents or something. So it means to make a liquid muddy, and it's not just something bubbling. It's the idea that it's getting dirty or you can't see through it anymore. Roiling, always used with water or with a liquid, often used with rivers and things like that. The roiling river. So you get the picture of a muddy river that's just bubbling as spring breakup comes and the melt from the snow comes into the river. Roiling river. Okay. Last one, I think. Yep. Last one is flourish. And you probably know you've probably seen this word before. Some people pronounce it flourish. I think the correct pronunciation is flourish. Even though it's spelled like flourish, it's not. It's pronounced flourish. So for something to flourish means it is doing well, it thrives, it grows or develops in a healthy or vigorous way. So let's read our context here. So they're describing somebody, an old friend we've seen before. He hoped they'd flourish on the side of the hill and come back to him. He hoped he could save their souls. Flourish. Something is flourishing, it's growing well, it's thriving, it's doing very well in its environment. So those are our words from up to chapter 15. Let's start reading now. I'm going to bounce all the way back. I'm going to have to scroll through. Let's close this. Okay. We are right here. So Chickadee had been taken, not hostage, but he had been taken without really understanding what was going on. He had been taken by the nuns and the father, and they're going to make a good white boy out of him, right? He's not sure he likes this, so he takes the knife, and he doesn't trust Mother. The mother was the leader of their little convent, or abbey. It wasn't an abbey yet, but she was the leader of their group of nuns. So, chapter 13. Let's get started. A desperate matter. The next morning, Chickadee woke to a rhythmical, brushing noise. He peeped out of his blanket to see Sister Seraphica on her hands and knees, scrubbing the wooden floor. As she scrubbed, she began to hum a lovely tune, and Chickadee crept from his blankets to listen. Seraphica stopped, sat back on her heels, and laughed. "Come here, little fellow," she said. She gestured in such a friendly way that Chickadee stood up and walked over to her. She took a piece of bread from her pocket. "I saved this for you," she said. Chickadee still did not understand a word anybody said, but when Seraphica spoke to him, she also made gestures with her hands. "Mother Anthony has begged some clothes for you," she said. "Today she means to clean you up. She isn't the gentlest person, but she only wants to help you. Oh, here she comes." The unsmiling mother stamped into the room right over Seraphica's clean floor. She held a pair of overalls, a mended shirt, and leather tie-up shoes. "Bring in a wash tub," she told Seraphica. "I've got the water heated up. I'll use your scrub brush." "Oh, Mother, no. It's much too rough." "He's got the dirt of the ancients on him, caked in," said Mother. "I'll use some of my strong lye soap." "That stings," Seraphica made a face. "Oh, you poor boy." Chickadee saw her look of concern and warily stepped backward. Mother Anthony shook the clothes at him. "These weren't easy to get. You'd better appreciate them." Chickadee was wearing a pair of soft-skin trousers, a buckskin shirt with fringe down the sides, which his mother had decorated with porcupine quills. His moccasins were lined with fur and kept his feet warm, while the leggings he wore doubled the insulation of his trousers. He had on a warm woolen vest, and in addition, he usually wore a pair of fur mitts and a fur-lined hood. But when Babiche had stolen him, he'd been sleeping without his hood and mitts. It was lucky that the night had been cold, and he kept on his vest and moccasins. From the way Mother gestured, Chickadee began to understand that she expected him to exchange his warm clothes for these poor rags. She stepped back further until he was standing against the wall. Seraphica carried a large wooden tub into the room. Another of the sisters brought a bucket of water. She poured it into the tub. Mother left and came back with a blanket and a steaming kettle and a strange-smelling waxy yellow cake. She poured the steaming kettle of water into the tub and then pointed at the tub, at Chickadee, the tub, Chickadee. He edged along the side of the room toward the door, but Seraphica was there, smiling. "Now, don't be scared," she said. "It won't last forever, and you'll feel so good and clean when it's done." Seraphica took his hand and drew him over to the tub. She tugged off his vest and then began to take off his shirt. Chickadee struggled out of her grip, but Mother was there and the other sister too. "Help!" cried Mother. Holding on to Chickadee, she and the others unlaced his moccasins, his leggings, removed his shirt, his pants. They rolled everything into a ball and then plunged him straight into the hot water. Although at that moment Chickadee was covered with ground and dirt, it was because he'd been living with Babiche and Baptiste. Omakayas kept her boys very clean, and their clothing as well. They bathed in cold water every single day, even in the winter when they used half-melted snow. Being dunked in steaming hot water was a shock, and Chickadee yelled out in fear. But when Mother had the scrub brush out and was sawing it across his back, leaving painful welts into which she rubbed the harsh lye soap, now Chickadee cried out in pain. Sister Seraphica tugged at Mother Anthony's wrists. "Oh, Mother Anthony, please, you're hurting him." "Don't be disrespectful, girl," cried Mother Anthony. Chickadee struggled, twisting and kicking to get away. But before Chickadee could wiggle away, Mother Anthony snatched up a pair of scissors to cut off his braids. When Chickadee saw the sharp scissors in her hands, he was sure he was going to die. With a desperate lunge, he ripped himself from the sister's grip and popped out of the tub. He grabbed his ball of clothes. Then, with a tremendous leap, he cleared out the table and raced out the door. He didn't stop once he got outside, but kept on running across the muddy yard and out into the safety of the woods. And even then, as the brush closed over behind him, he kept on running. With the ball of clothing under his arm, he sped as fast as he could through the underbrush, in which direction he couldn't tell. It didn't matter. He heard their calls at first, and then their calls died out, and there was only the sweet sounds of the woods. After some time, he entered a great stand of pine, and all he heard was the tossing high in the pine needles. That sound had always lulled him to sleep. He felt better, but still, he kept going. When he'd run until he was exhausted, he stopped and put on his old familiar clothing. He tied on his leggings and his moccasins. He looked around carefully for any sign they were following. He listened. His heart thumped wildly, but there was no sound of pursuit. Chickadee breathed more easily, took stock of where he was. Moss clung to the colder, moister sides of the huge pine trees, telling him which way to go. So he started walking, the way the trees pointed, north, Chickadee, home. As Chickadee set off for home, his family met in Pembina, at the cabin of Chickadee's uncle Quill. It wasn't a very large cabin, and everyone was crowded into it talking. "Quill isn't here," said his wife, Margaret. The grown-ups sat wrapped in their blankets on the pounded earth floor and ate the dried moose meat that Omachias had brought along, seasoned with the new maple sugar. "Where has he gone?" asked Omachias. "Quill was hired on the ox cart train down to St. Paul," said his wife proudly. "He made his own cart and is hauling for the fur trader." "Our little brother has become a responsible man," laughed Angeline, nodding at Omachias. The packs of furs that Anamikins, Two Strike, Fishtail, and Miquam had worked hard for all winter were stacked around them. Two Strike had also killed a beaver on the way to Pembina, and its skin was stretched out on a willow hoop. Its skin was stretched out on a willow hoop. The beaver meat was boiling on the little stove that heated the house. Quill had surprised everyone. From a wild boy who drove his sister Omachias half crazy, he'd become a young man. He was not a completely sensible young man, but he'd managed to build a cabin and even plant some potatoes. This was all because he wanted to keep his wife, who threatened to leave him if he kept up with his old wild ways. Margaret was half French and half Ojibwe. Both sides of her were no-nonsense sides, McCoons thought. This was the first time the family had met her, and McCoons could tell that although she tried to be nice, her real feelings showed through. "Come in," she had said, but her face said, "Stay out." "Sit down and have some tea," she said out loud, but her face said, "I wish you'd go away." The inside walls were whitewashed, pasted over with written papers. A bed, covered with thick blankets, was pushed against one wall, and there were two chairs at a small wooden table. Day sat on one chair. Margaret gave the other to Nokomis. Everyone stood uncomfortably until Margaret asked them to sit down on the bed. A tiny wood stove with a pipe sticking into the wall glowed hotly. Margaret put more wood in the fire and set a kettle of water on top to boil. Everyone ran out of things to say, suddenly, and stared at the floor. Margaret was silent until Day began to speak to her in her language, Metis, which was a combination of French and Ojibwe, just like her family. Day had learned the language when he was a little boy. Margaret smiled a little, and then Day made her laugh. She got up, moved a large pot onto the stove, and still talking to Day, warmed up some stew and made a bannock. As everyone ate, Day explained everything that Margaret had told him in her language. Margaret had described how she had persuaded Quill to settle down, make a garden, and pray. She described the long expeditions to hunt buffalo that the two went on together with her family. Day said that Margaret was very strict about going to the Catholic Church, and that once she found out why the family had left the sugar bush, she had said she would pray hard for Chickadee's return. The family began to talk to Margaret through Day, who translated everything they said. Since we know who took our Chickadee, said Omakayas, we have agreed to intercept them here when they deliver the mail. Even now we have our lookouts, Two Strike, Fishtail, and Anamikin, said Nokomis. They will not let those skunks get away. We will wait here, said Mikwam, for Quill to return. Margaret looked worriedly at her bed. Then her face brightened, and she told Day something that took a long time to explain. Day nodded from time to time as she spoke, and then he looked very thoughtful. Finally, he told the family what he had heard. Margaret is urging us to stay in Pembina. She says that so many families have moved on to the other town, St. Joseph, because of the flooding, that there are abandoned cabins. She says that Quill misses us and wishes we were here to hunt the buffalo. She misses her own family, who have moved on even further west. She wishes we would stay here, only not in her bed. Day smiled as he said the last sentence. We are only here to collect Chickadee and sell the winter's furs, said Omakayas. She and Anamikins lived far off in the bush for a good reason. Wherever people gathered, so did illness. We will bring Chickadee back with us, she said. At the mention of his brother's name, Macoons felt his spirits sink. He leaned against his mother. He felt that only she missed his twin as much as he did. Ni mama, he whispered, I dreamed about Chickadee again last night. Omakayas put her arm around his shoulders. Every bite of the bannock was tasty and soft, especially dipped in the tea and maple syrup that Margaret provided. His grandfather winked at Macoons in sympathy, but still, he was so lonely for Chickadee that every bite, every sip, made him lonelier. He couldn't help wondering if his brother had anything as good to eat. He couldn't help wanting to share. My brother's wife, said Omakayas at last through Day to Margaret. It has been a good visit. We will find somewhere else to sleep tonight. If we have Chickadee, we'll be warm and happy anywhere we camp. Wait, said Yellow Kettle suddenly, and listen and think. We have come so far. This is our chance to see your brother, Quill, my son. If there's a good place for us to live, we can stay and gather up our winter's food. It might be a good idea. There's another reason, said Day. There's a school here. He pointed at the wall. The twins must learn to read and to write the white man's language. If they do not do this, everything will be stolen from them. Not if we go back. Not if we live far from everybody, cried Omakayas, holding Macoons. There is good in what everyone says, said Nokomis, but we cannot decide this until we know for sure whether we can stay in one of those left-behind houses. Everyone agreed that this was true, and in addition, that they would have to wait for Chickadee's return somewhere. But not in Margaret's bed, as she was very protective of her pretty bed, it was clear. As the family took leave of Margaret, she entreated them to think over all she had said. This time, when she spoke, her face did not have the opposite expression. She meant it. She had begun to like Quill's family very much, and although she didn't want them to take over her carefully groomed cabin, she wanted them very much to stay. Chapter 15. At the Mercy of Two Strike. I will not stir, said Two Strike. She sat on a rock and sharpened each of her knives on another rock. She stared into the distance. So did Anamikins and Fishtail. After a time, the air grew dark and cold. Fishtail made a fire. Anamikins took out some dried pemmican. They ate. They slept. They woke again and waited. Two Strike kept a lookout while the two men hunted. The air grew dark and cold again, and Fishtail built up the fire. Anamikins roasted the rabbits he'd caught. The three ate, slept, and waited again by the fire. At first, there was just a dot on the horizon. It was a curious dot. After it appeared, it disappeared. Then, after a time, it appeared again. The dot seemed to go forward, then backward to enlarge and shrink. It wavered and sank out of sight. When it finally got big enough so that the watchers could tell it was a man carrying a large load, Two Strike growled. Something is wrong here, said Anamikins. Let's find out, said Fishtail. The three ran toward the strange figure and soon reached Babiche, who staggered beneath a tremendous weight. His brother was on his back, groaning and half-conscious. The huge canvas mail sack was at his feet. For all his other faults, Babish had two fierce loyalties. He had carried his brother, then the mail sack, then his brother again, whenever he could not walk. Somehow, as a result of this extreme effort, the two brothers and the mail sack had continued along the trail. Merci, mon Dieu, merci beaucoup, cried Babish. Come help me, my friends. Ah! Suddenly, he recognized that Two Strike was not a man. Not only that, but she had a knife between her teeth and two knives in her hands and was running straight at him. In a flash, the words of Orph Carter rang in Babish's head, and he sunk to his knees. He dumped his brother on the ground and put his beefy hands in the air. Pardon! Pardon! He cried. In a bound, Two Strike reached him and loomed over him. Anna Makins was right behind. Where is Chickadee? Babish's eyes welled with tears. What do you mean, Chickadee? You want a little bird? I haven't seen one. Gaween, you lying son of a skunk, said Two Strike. We want the boy you stole. Where is he? Boy? Babish gave a frozen grin. On the ground, Baptiste had stopped groaning. He was pretending to be dead. If you don't answer me right now, said Two Strike, all the knives come out. Oh, yes, I remember, Babish blubbered. The boy wanted to go with us. Anna Meekins grabbed Babish around the throat and lifted him with one hand. We took the boy, Babish gasped. Ah, oui, I admit this, but my friend, you have two, both the same. Could you not spare one? Anna Meekins could not help his hand from squeezing. His desperation was the boundless desperation of a father who loves his son. Behind them, Fishtail restrained Two Strike from using at least 3 of her knives on Babish Right then, Babish gestured wildly for Anna Meekins to let go of his neck so he could talk. Anna Meekins dropped him, and Babish choked, rubbing his neck. Talk, and be quick about it, said Fishtail. When, my brother took sick, I sent the boy to our little house with the horses. He kindly took them. He was a very good boy. He's probably back there by now with the horses, a cozy fire going, a nice pot of bouillon cooking. Wretch! What are you talking about, servant? Two Strike said. We made him our servant, yes, said Babish in a tiny voice. But now, great lady, my brother and I will serve you. We will be happy to serve you. Chickadee should be your master, cried Two Strike. Where is this house? Anna Makins was becoming dangerous with frustration. Servant, indeed, his little son. Babish trembled as he gave directions to the cabin. Even as he shuddered, though, he was filled with admiration for Two Strike. He looked at his brother Baptiste, had opened one eye just a crack, and its gleam told Babish that he thought Two Strike was magnificent. We have treated the boy like our own son, cried Babish, because we heard of the beauty of this vision before us, this woman, Two Strike. Two Strike bent over and snarled at him. This snarl completely melted the heart of Babish. He begged her to marry him, and his brother too, right on the spot. And the horses will be our wedding gift, he said. Two Strike's hand grabbed his throat. You are lucky to escape with your life, she said. If I ever see you or your brother again, I'll slice you to ribbons, I'll tear you to shreds, I'll grind you to a pulp. I'll destroy you. Oh, what heavens! Cried Babish. My heart is already mashed like a boiled potato. Baptiste lifted his head, dizzy with emotion. And mine is crushed like a rotten turnip. We are a booyah of love boiling for you, they shouted together. But the two were calling after quickly disappearing Two Strike. She and Anna Meekins had already started running, following along Babish's trail. Left with the two brothers and the mail sack, Fishtail spoke with furious disgust. You can carry your stinking brother, he said. I will take the mail. Fishtail soon left Babish staggering beneath the load of Baptiste and strode into town. He dropped the mail off at the steps of a small wooden church where he saw a priest working. He spoke to the priest for a minute, then continued on until he came to his family. They were just starting out from Quill's cabin. When Omachias didn't see either Chickadee or Anna Meekins, her face fell. She bravely held on to Nokomis, and together the little family listened to Fishtail's story. When he had finished, they sat right down where they were, It was a pretty spot on a small hill that sloped down to the roiling river. Meekwam and Fishtail took out their pipes, smoked them, prayed, and together the family looked into their hearts. They needed direction, and they knew that they had to wait here as patiently as they could. The question was, how long? "We don't know how long," Fishtail said at last. "That is the problem. But I do know that our son is clever, and we have taught him how to live like an Anishinaabe." "Perhaps we think over what Quill's wife told us," said Omakaya said, slowly. She was reluctant to live in a town, but more than anything, she wanted the return of her son. "We will not stay with Quill, or rather not with Margaret," said Yellow Kettle. Omakayas and Nokomis silently agreed, flashing a look of assurance at each other. "If there is nowhere to live, we'll make our own cabin," said Meekwam. "And plant our own garden," said Nokomis. All along the way from the island they had come from, far back in the lake, she had gathered seeds from other gardeners. Now she had a pouch of seeds she guarded day and night. She was eager to plant them. "I have been wanting to live in a cabin like the one we had so long ago," said Meekwam. "When they bring back our Chickadee, we'll have a place ready for us to live." Nokomis smiled at the memory and patted Yellow Kettle's hand. Perhaps some of them were not eager to leave the island of Lake of the Woods, where the fish were plentiful and the berries grew thick. On the other hand, the only way to find Chickadee was to stay where they were and to wait. That very day, the family took their packs of furs to the traders. As they were beautifully prepared and well kept, and as Meekwam and Yellow Kettle were good bargainers, they got the best price possible. Next, the family went to the priest Fishtail had met, Father Belcourt. The first priest, Father Ganin, had told Father Belcourt all about the family. Father Belcourt was known to be sympathetic to the Ojibwe and to the Metis. He often came along on the buffalo hunts and provided a blessing, helped the hunters get along, and said a mass of thanks when the hunt was over. Now, they asked the priest where land was available. Father Belcourt was just leaving the little cabin next to the church where he lived. He spoke Ojibwe with Meekwam and pointed out a plot of land high enough to stay clear of the river's floodwaters. Many people made the mistake of building too close to the Red River, he said, and it cost them dearly come spring. The land he pointed out had been abandoned. It belonged to a family that had just left for St. Joseph, just as Margaret had said. There was a cabin on it already, the roof collapsed from winter snow. There was even a garden laid out alongside and the beginnings of a pole barn for horses. "You will need horses out here on the plains," said Father Belcourt. "True enough," said Meekwam. Omakayas gave Father Belcourt a makak of maple sugar. It was a special basket with a picture of a wild goose on the side and fit with a clever lid. "Such nice work," said the priest, "and my favorite food. Nothing beats the excellent taste of your maple sugar." His long, grave face brightened with pleasure, and he smiled at all of them. As they walked toward the hill, carrying all that belonged to them, his smile became thoughtful. Here was an intelligent and hard-working family. He would like to have them in his church, and the children in his school. He hoped they'd flourish on the side of the hill and come back to him. He hoped he could save their souls. That very day, the family set about making themselves a new place to live. Fishtail and Meekwam set the fallen rafters aside and straightened out the log walls. Omakayas and Nokomis mixed mud with broken grass and wood chips to set between the logs. Macoons and Zozi were sent down to the river to haul water. Yellow Kettle fetched wood, chopped it into a pile, and made a fire in a sheltered area where she could cook. The dogs, their harnesses and loads removed, roamed the area and hunted for rabbits. After hauling bucket after bucket of water, Macoons and Zozi decided to try catching some fish. There were other people by the river catching fish, big fat ones with golden eyes and rough scales. One of them had thrown a smaller fish aside, which Macoons picked up. He whittled 2 sharp fish hooks from a bit of wood. Each had a coil of strong and slender line from Meekwam, who had bought it along with the other supplies. Zozi sliced the small fish to ribbons, and then she and Macoons baited their hooks. One fish, another. The fish were biting hard in the spring flood, hungry from their winter's fast. When they had a neat string of fish, they carried them up the hill. That night, Yellow Kettle baked them in the coals of the fire and seasoned them with maple sugar. As Macoons ate, he wondered what his brother was eating, and his chest began to hurt all around his heart. He put down his food and crept into his blankets. He put his hand over his face, but his tears leaked through his fingers. And that's the end of chapter 15. leaving kind of at a sad place, but we do know that Chickadee is safe, or at least he was when he ran away, and he's not too far away. So tune back in later this week and we'll read the next installment. Thank you guys for listening. I hope you guys have a great week.